Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. I apologise for the slight delay. I wrote my talk using an old-fashioned bit of technology on a paper, and so this desk, which is beautifully set up for computers, entails kind of interesting workaround of iPhones and cardboard boxes, and I hope I don't knock things over so that I can see when I write. And this is, as you will see, a very telling instance of what I want to talk about today, which is the ways in which digital works, or indeed doesn't work, in and around the classroom. Siva said yesterday, in I think concluding his keynote lecture, that the important thing is not to study specific technologies, but to study what people do with them. And I took heart from that, because that is exactly what I want to do today. And I want to talk about what a very small number of people do with technologies in a particular North London suburb. And I hope that my small number of participants can stand for something larger, though we can debate just how typical and how large is the group that they may stand for. So I'm talking about a project that falls within a wider enterprise, which is being called connected learning. I put a question mark at the end of connected learning, and then I took it off, and then I put it back, and it's not there now, but maybe it should be there. Questions about connected learning, or the ways in which learning can become connected in a digital age. So this is the name of a research network funded by the MacArthur Foundation, with Mimi Ito at the University of California, Irvine, running it. And we are a small number of projects linked together ourselves as a network as part of an exploration, a largely qualitative, but not only qualitative, exploration of the possibilities and potential of connected learning for children and young people. So connected learning, as you may see in the first bullet and as illustrated in the graphic, is a way of thinking about learning that integrates interest-based peer friendships and learning goals of adult-driven institutions. Essentially, the ways in which learning may and perhaps should connect across the sites of home, school, and community. And those of you who know Mimi Ito's previous book, Hanging Out, Messing Around and Geeking Out, will recognize this as the kind of next step of that work. And the key issue in that next step is to understand whether the kinds of learning that go on in informal sites and domestic sites can, in useful and constructive ways, transfer into formal learning settings, whether they can transfer into the school. So kids do many exciting things with technologies at home, in communities, online. Does that have any purchase within the school, and could it? So this is, if you like, being offered as a solution, or being developed as a potential solution for a very evident and widespread problem, which is the concern and disillusion with the state of education, and particularly anxieties about education and its many failures, inequalities and exclusions as traditionally instituted within formal structures such as the school and colleges. And the hope is that in a network society, the new possibilities for connection, which can bridge different sites, may have a way of transcending across the different sites of learning, and as Craig Watkins says there, enabling something which is more mobile, more engaged, more student-driven, and potentially also still producing learning and knowledge which is valued within educational and civic settings. So we are just at the point of writing a report in which we try to pull together the evidence that shows firstly why connected learning might provide a better route to learning and harness the energy and interests of young people, and also why the digital might provide the infrastructure, the means by which that can be better enabled. So this is not thinking about digital technologies as they can enable the school to do better what it already does, which is, if you like, a traditional individualized notion of learning. And it's not thinking simply about kind of leveling the playing field, but it's thinking about whether there can be a different kind of learning. So the network has a set of projects, which I've put the URL there. I won't talk about them in detail, though, since it's perpetually 3:30 in this room, I have more time than I think, perhaps. You can't see that, but I can. What's interesting about the different projects being networked together is that they're looking at children and young people of all ages from about 5 years old through to about 30 years old. And really looking at the different sites in which learning takes place, especially focusing on the potential for transfer across sites. And within that, I'm working with Julian Sefton-Green on the project here called The Class. And I named the project after a very nice French film. Has anyone seen The Class? A few people. Good. Okay, so it immediately encapsulates what our project is about, which is a class of 13 to 14-year-olds in a Parisian suburb, which is, if you like, the classic container classroom. And the French education system is famous for being fantastically kind of traditional, authoritarian, and a world unto its own. And a young, enthusiastic teacher has the idea that he would like to bring the life of the students outside the class into the classroom in order to enrich and enable their learning and make porous the boundary between these different spaces. And indeed, the students' mobile phones, as well as other technologies from paper to electronic, also form some of the ways in which he tries to enable that transfer of learning across sites. As you may anticipate, the experiment goes dreadfully wrong. The class is in chaos and confusion, and all kinds of unanticipated problems mean that very little learning takes place until a kind of final, rather provisional resolution. So I named the project also as a kind of cautionary tale about how some grand hopes for what the digital can do in terms of connecting sites, connecting activities, connecting people. We also have it's also a cautionary tale of how that can go wrong and how difficult it can be to manage. So it is, I mean, I'm deliberately using the word connection in two senses. Connection as connecting people, spaces and activities, and then connection in terms of the digital and the way in which digital networks can underpin and provide an infrastructure for those kinds of social and learning connections. And so the purpose is to try and understand whether, as the children who drew this image rather enthusiastically thought, we can connect the technological, the social, the economic. The future of the internet is part of our future, as indeed they would hope it to be. And I think it's the collaborative possibilities and the connected possibilities more than the informational possibilities, the search possibilities of the internet that I'm particularly interested in here. And as you will see, I'm also wishing to interrogate but also pursue the possibilities of what is evidently a very normative project. So can connected learning really provide a solution to a very sizable problem? Peter mentioned that I've been running a network of 33 countries in Europe, which is indeed occupied my last few years. One of the things we just did was a survey of children across 25 of those countries, just trying to understand what they do online, how they use technologies, what the internet means to them. And I just illustrate this with the notion of the ladder of opportunities, just as a reminder, really, that there are many ways in which children are not yet fulfilling either their potential, as we might see it, or indeed the potential of what the digital can offer. You probably can't read the details, but I think you get the general gist, which is to say, at the bottom of this metaphorical ladder, There are some rather simple kind of traditional mass communication activities that children engage with. They look things up, they watch on YouTube, they play games by themselves, and as they progress, it becomes fewer and fewer children who do the more collaborative, more creative, more complex kinds of activities. And I've just tracked the activities and which children in which cultural contexts make it further up the ladder. You may dislike the metaphor for being linear, but I think it kind of makes a point that there are many barriers that we need to understand that allow children to go further or less far. And so in a sense, the very provision of opportunities is a provision for the possibility of inequalities and differences. One of the key themes of the Mimito's Connected Learning project is to not think just about the barriers to climbing up this ladder in terms of children's access, skills and motivation to use digital technologies in certain ways, but also to think about the kinds of spaces in which they may use them. The spaces, the affordances, the interfaces, the ways in which they come to access technological infrastructures are of course all designed, and they're designed with particular conceptions of use in mind. And in relation to education, they're designed with particular conceptions of education in mind. And so part of the point, indeed, of the wider MacArthur enterprise is to think about redesigning those spaces so that the activities and uses of those within them are themselves transformed by virtue of these redesigned spaces. So you may or may not know that there are various informal learning sites being developed across this country where children can, as it were, hang out, mess around and geek out productively according to their interests and indeed according to the judgments and values of the adults who support them. And there are a few schools, one indeed in Chicago, the Quest schools, which have completely redesigned the school around the possibilities for learning that digital media can enable. And I think it's that, in a way, it's that kind of bigger vision of not just looking at the skills and interests of the individual learner, but understanding how the digital can be part of the redesign of the space within which they learn. That is part of the excitement of the project. But most kids do not go to interesting, redesigned, technologically complex, creative schools. They go to perfectly ordinary schools, what the education minister in Britain once brilliantly called the bog standard school, and that is where they go. And in an ordinary school, it's the barriers to connection that are far more salient very often than the enablers of connection. So it took me about 5 minutes to wander around the school I'm going to tell you about, to take these images of the ways in which technology is seen not as a possibility, but as a threat. And it's the connective potential of the technologies that is particularly seen as the threat. So the promise is less to be harnessed than to be controlled, and the rules at school, which are very many, prevent the children from doing all kinds of things. Indeed, they almost prevented us from getting access to the school to do our project in the first place, because the possibility that I might look at a child's phone in a school and see an illegal or problematic image on their phone, on their Facebook, was sufficient to stop the school permitting us access to. We promised we would not look at their phones, which is an impediment to studying what children do with their phones and with their technologies. But never mind, we make our compromises. So how the technologies are deployed within a traditional setting, far from a redesigned setting, causes all kinds of anxieties, particularly about risks, about addiction, about distraction from learning, about problematic motivations that children might have. And as I just did on this desk this morning, of course the kids operate all kinds of workarounds to enable them, in fact, to use their phones or their Facebook or whatever in school. So we set up, in the traditional setting, a kind of adult versus child tension in which struggle and evasion are far more salient than enabling and supporting, which is the premise of the Connected Learning project. And some of these evidently are not really struggles about technology, they are rather age-old struggles between adults and children about values, about independence and dependence, about authority, and about how we conceive of what it is the child spontaneously wants to do if left alone to get on with it. The premise of connected learning is that what the child wants to do, what they are interested in, will in fact be motivating, beneficial, and appropriate as if harnessed, rather than always something to be feared and sceptical of. So that longer tension between adults and children and questions of dependence and independence and whose values should predominate is, of course, itself historically and sociologically shifting. And most sociologists of childhood will analyse this in terms of a longer trend towards individualisation, in which it is precisely the increasing autonomy of children away from the defining values and supports of adult society that characterises many of their activities. So we can understand the tension between agency and structure in terms of a history of individualisation. And it's at that point, a sort of an interesting point in the tensions between adults and children and who determines the future, that the last 10 years have seen this transformation of the digital. And so the digital has become absolutely associated with and invested with all of these meanings and anxieties. So it's in that context that I ask, does the digital matter? And this slide pays some tribute to the work of Dana Boyd, who's sitting in the front, though every time I think about how the digital might matter, I start tweaking and extending and thinking differently about what it is that we really think the digital might do in terms of enabling particular models of learning. So this is my currently preferred list, drawing on the work, in fact, of a number of different scholars. The point, I think, is that the digital can be seen to afford some kinds of reconfiguring of all the processes, actions, and interests that have always been part of learning. Learning becomes a much longer process. The digital reconfigures some of the ways in which people can collaborate, explore, express themselves, address others, and I think crucially for the question of agency and structure, where I was vaguely waving in the direction of Anthony Giddens' work, the possibilities that that then generates for kind of reflexivity. The participants in these struggles between children and adults, what is learning, what is valued, how should I act, the participants are all highly aware that these are the struggles they're engaged in. These are reflexive and kind of reflected upon tensions about power, control, and self-determination. So in a way, the digital seems to offer and enable some of the kinds of excitements and possibilities that the connected learning enterprise wishes to provide, given the very many concerns and anxieties about the state of education in this and indeed in many other countries. But we have to acknowledge there's very little evidence as yet that the learning and participation that young people are engaged in are in any way transformed by the digital technologies that they have access to. And one reason for that is the ladder of opportunities I outlined. Most young people, in fact, using the internet for rather low-level, receptive, rather than creative and participatory tasks. And another is the way in which the spaces within which they learn and participate are have not yet been redesigned so as to harness the possibilities of the digital. So rather than taking a broad approach, I offered Nosh the choice, I said, do you want me to talk about my 25,000 children I just surveyed, or do you want me to talk about the 27 children that I'm studying right now? He said, Sonia, talk about the 27. So I'm now going to go in deep and tell you about a very particular set of kids, and I hope that they and their stories do stand for something else. So here is a little bit of North London. I'm sorry I used pink and blue for the kids and where they lived. but never mind. And the purple is the school. And I'm basing now a year's fieldwork project around this particular site. And I think what's kind of interesting about this site is that in a way, people have always lived in, or for many years they've lived in streets close by, they've had their parks and their train stations and so forth. And yet, in the last 10 years, all of these homes have been transformed by the arrival of the internet, and the kinds of connections and possibilities between these houses and these children's homes has been hugely expanded. So let's ask the question, does it allow that new flexibility, publicness, collaboration and reflexivity, now that these little spots are, as it were, all connected digitally, but are they connected in terms of learning and participation? So here's my particular site, and here are the research questions for the project, which I can now kind of state formally, having given you this introduction, which is to say, can we understand ways in which social networks, including digitally mediated networks, enable or impede young people's learning with and through digital media? Do children's digital media activities, as they're embedded in their daily practices and regimes of learning in and beyond the classroom, do they enable new forms of connected or perhaps disconnected learning? And how can the wider opportunity structures of peers, school and family and community, those kind of key sites that constrain children's lives, can they enable a greater diversity of learning outcomes? Can they support more kinds of engagement, expertise and efficacy? And to answer these questions, I and Julian Sefton-Green, my colleague, have spent a year doing a kind of quasi-ethnographic study of a class of 28 children aged between their one class in an ordinary school and they're the year group that turns 13 to 14, so I think in the States they're year 8th grade. Okay, we're trying to focus on the ordinary. Much of the Connected Learning Research Network is more interested in the extraordinary, the kind of the leading edge creative activities that young gamers are engaged in, that young digital composers are engaged in, that those collaborating in kind of various peer-to-peer sites online are engaged in. I really wanted to say, okay, let's just understand whether any of this is touching the lives of ordinary children and how can we understand how that might be transforming their lives. So you can kind of read all of this, just give you something about the demographics and the shaping of the school. And the crucial thing about the design then is that we spent the first term sitting in the classroom observing what the kids were doing. I'm kind of taller than your average 13-year-old, though not some of the boys, but still I sat in the back of the classroom and I just listened to lesson after lesson, maths and French and German and, I don't know, geography and information technology and so on. We sat in the classes for a term, following the kids around, interviewing the kids, interviewing the teachers. For the second term, we went home with the kids and we saw their home space, we met their parents, interviewed the parents or the siblings, met the dog and the hamster, all of that. Did a kind of media tour of the house, went with the kids on Facebook because the parents said yes, even though the school said no, and tried to understand the kind of domestic space. And then in the next term, and we're still in the middle, so I won't talk about that, we started following the kids around in the community where they went. So we went to the music lessons, we went to watch the football match, we did a number of focus groups around use of Twitter or all kinds of other things the kids were doing. And we are absolutely kind of in the middle of that. So let me give you two kinds of analysis, preliminary, of what I think we're finding so far. First, I want to focus on the spaces of learning and the possible connections among them. And I'm going to focus on the home and the school as two sites and think about the ways in which the digital may be connecting and allowing transfer across the two. So what does the home look like through the eyes of the teachers, for example? What does the school look like through the eyes of the parents? How are they connected? Do we see positive transfer of interest, knowledge and expertise from one to the other, as the theory of connected learning anticipates, and especially can I see ways in which that is enabled by digital and networked media. And note as a footnote here that the research literature offers very little help. When you read the research literature on the use of information communication technologies in educational settings, it really does address the container classroom. It has very little vision of the home setting. And similarly, when you read media studies work about the home, there is very little recognition that children spend 6 or 8 hours of their days in school. So we need to bring these literatures together. Then secondly, and more tentatively, I want to turn to the distinction between the social and the individual and think about the ways in which my 28 children are networked together. Because the point was to try and pick one class and not study 28 random individuals, but precisely to understand them as a very, very small network. And here too, I think there's rather little help from the literature, particularly in relation to children, where very often children as learners, children as technology users are talked about individually more than they are talked about as in their kind of networked contexts. So, as you'll have seen, the first kind of analysis I want to offer you examines the institutional structures that shape and determine children's lives, particularly the home and the school. And the second focuses on the agency, on the network, on the sort of networks and possibilities that they build for themselves. And both evidently rely on digital media. When we first walked into the school, the most striking thing was not the networking, any networks among the children, but the teachers' intranet, which was a constantly used and what did I do there? I don't think I touched anything. Sure I didn't touch anything, gosh. Touch the screen, huh? Yes. Went off. Touch it. Okay, all right. So when we first walked into the school, it was the teacher's intranet that was the most striking. It was, if you like, the antithesis of a connected digital media learning environment. Every day, every class, the teachers were monitoring the achievement, the behaviour, positive and negative, of all the children. And they were adding to the intranet, perhaps a teacher might add 30 data points to the intranet in a lesson, and at the end of a day, a child might have 6 or 8 extra bits of data recorded about them, which is to say that they did well in French, they were late for maths, the whole class did a great drama project, and where on earth were they at lunchtime? And at the end of the day, the teacher reads out what the intranet records for that day, and people get clapped or they get detention. And so our field notes were kind of full, initially, of this very detailed recording of individual within school performance in terms of assessment, clear assessment criteria. We began by being shocked by this, and then we began interviewing the teachers, the parents, and the children, and they all said they really liked it. And I had to start thinking, actually, there is something positive about a very instrumentalized and individualized use of technologies to monitor and track the success of learning. So what did they say? They felt that somehow this ineffable process of learning was rendered amenable and visible and comprehensible by the tracking that says, yes, good in this subject, bad in that subject. They felt that the demands, which were quite high, the pressures on the kids, were made clear. The power of the school was somehow made accountable. You could go and complain, why did my child get a bad mark in this or seem to behave badly? And it kind of tamed the fears of disruption and chaos. The whole thing was made orderly by this process. The school's intranet relied, as I've just implied, on a kind of thoroughgoing instrumentalized concept of learning. So learning is carefully monitored in terms of levels, and children and teachers spoke a language together of levels, which I also found fascinating and surprising. So they didn't say, could you all learn this particular piece of algebra? They would say, this is a level 6 piece of algebra, and I would like you to strive to level 7, but I only expect you to do level 5. And the kids would kind of talk back, you know, what did you learn in school today? I learned a level 6 question in French. It was a kind of shared, discussed language of individual, instrumentalized achievement and individualized learning paths. So you can see that the school is kind of papered with illustrations of what the levels mean. And what was particularly interesting to us, given our project, was the way in which the clubs that were part of the informal learning environment of the school were used to kind of support. So that it was as if, in a way, the school has already embodied some of the rhetoric of connected learning and understands that the informal learning outside can then be kind of brought into the informal clubs within the school, and that will then enable learning. So the teacher would say you should go to these clubs because it will enable your levels, or it will look good on your CV, not that you should go to these clubs to learn about maths or Shakespeare or ICT, whatever it is. So the kind of first interesting point then was to observe children's resistance to this. And keep my theory in mind. So the theory is that learning is good to transfer across different sites. Because it has been so instrumentalized by the school, this was a key point of children's resistance. The children were not going to the clubs, and children were very they were full of excuses about why they couldn't go. Well, the teachers were very keen on them shining. The interviews with children and parents that the teachers ran said, you know, we need to know what you're going to shine at, what you can be an asset at, what you can achieve your maximum potential at. So the sort of the rhetoric of learning has become heavily instrumentalized, and this was a point. So the children were happy with the regime within the school. They were resisting the point at which the regime blurred out into their interests and lives beyond the school. It was precisely the connected learning bit that they were resisting. Why? Well, David Buckingham has talked about the curricularization of leisure, the kind of the spread of the logic of a school into the home, into children's interests and what they see as their spheres of autonomy. And all of their lives have become kind of harnessed to this larger task of achievement. So, in a sense, what we have is a kind of traditional vision of a container classroom, heavily assessment-orientated, satisfied children within the school, but children kind of unknown and resisting knowledge in their activities outside the school. And bearing in mind the kind of vast underuse of technological possibilities that I already described in the ladder of opportunities, you can see that connected learning, or indeed digital media learning, was rather little evident in this school. So I'll just give you a few quick examples. The interactive whiteboard I very rarely saw being used for interactive purposes. It was used as one way. The media owned by the school were always used in the hands of teachers, not in the hands of pupils, and the media owned by pupils was banned. As you saw, the teachers themselves were full of a very interesting kind of argument about the potential of technology to enable learning. And some were very resistant to using it, or they disagreed about how it could be used. But what they were all agreed on is that the ways in which children use technology at home is completely irrelevant to anything that they might be able to do in the school. There's no, for the teachers, there is no creative productive geeking out and messing around that can be kind of brought into the school and somehow harnessed. That is just kids wasting time on Facebook. When we asked the children what makes for a good lesson or a good teacher, they did not ever talk about the use of technology. They talked about teachers who allowed them to be active, who allowed them to do something in the class rather than sit and learn. And that sense of action, I think, is really important. And then, of course, our field notes record a kind of litany of failures. A project that was meant to link children's informal fundraising up with a global UNESCO challenge. The website went down on the occasion. The children couldn't make the connections with those in other schools. The teacher had a maths blog, which doesn't ever get used. The virtual learning environment is very little used for this age group. Okay, a kind of litany of rather depressing failures of technology despite the potential. When we went home, I think the story is a bit different because technology is much better integrated, much more comfortably integrated into the home than it is into the school setting, even though parents themselves are extremely anxious about what it means. But there were lots of ways in which it was kind of happily there as part of the bedroom culture, a part of the living room kind of entertainment field. But for the parents, there was very little idea about how any of this might transfer into the learning or the school setting beyond the kind of general hope that we got it because it would help the kids with their education. But going beyond to how it might help, how it might network, who they might be in touch with, what they might share, you can't tell so much. I've included just one girl's Facebook site, her mobile uploads of Play-Doh cakes, which happen to be her fascination, just to kind of show some of the kind of fun and colour that technology represented in the home, which was really very little evident in the school. And I also have a whole collection of photographs of siblings and dogs and rabbits, and the home space is the comfortable, the personalised, the gendered, the fan space, the geek space, the space where a kind of flow state of learning can be achieved, but it isn't shaped by the learning objectives of the school, and it isn't necessarily highly networked into the ways in which children can facilitate connected learning. So I found myself going back to an image which I actually got a child to draw some years ago, and I still think it has some pertinence. So this was asking, lots of kids drew me these pictures, but this child had a great sense of symmetry. So, so I started going back to work I'd done before on the idea of bedroom culture. How does a child want to live? What could the home be? And I think this is a kind of very popular fantasy. And of course, it's a fantasy that is all about escaping adults. This is not about escaping peers, because a lot of the technology, I mean, now there would be, well, actually I think there is a computer in the centre, but now there would be more digital networked technologies in there. Connecting with the peers they want, but escaping those kind of supposedly mentoring adult supports that connected learning was really, or is really trying to foster, is not so strong. So the televisions I now see as a kind of a wall against adults, and a wall also against children's number one fear, which is boredom. And we have a lot of interviews about boredom in the project, which is also quite extraordinary. The telephones all around the bed, as Junior explained to me, was one to call every different girl, so that was his particular fantasy. The boundaries of the child space and the adult space are really, I'm proving myself technologically incompetent. Thank you, Peter. The boundaries are really important to the kids, and the technologies are the means by which they negotiate these boundaries. And so I'm really using this slide to kind of think less about whether children should all be connected in their learning and their leisure, or whether they should be disconnected, but rather to think about who has control over the possibilities for the connections, and to recognise some pleasures of disconnection. Because I think I've given you a kind of litany of technological and social failures which lead to disconnection, but also I think the kids some of their workarounds, some of their resistance, and some of their pleasures are finding positive pleasures in disconnection. And it's in that context then that I would think about how they use Facebook, and I hope I've appropriately anonymised those, how they would use Facebook, and just think about Sherry Turkle's recent quote in Alone Together, where she said, "The ties that we form through the internet are not the ties that bind, but they are the ties that preoccupy." And what we could see, there was a lot of talk in the project about Facebook not really being very important. They're on it all the time, but it's not really very interesting to them anymore. And the kids have a whole set of critiques of how they prefer the face-to-face, how they really want to be with their friends, how this is a kind of it's preoccupying because it's keeping open, if you like, a sphere of action possibilities. It wards off the boredom, it keeps open all the channels of communication, it's largely phatic rather than content creating, and it's just keeping them in that peer space. Okay, I see that time is running by, and I just wanted to show you a little bit about the individual and the social network, but I am at an early stage of thinking about this, so I'm just going to show you how these kids could be seen as networked together, and if anyone has insights on how to develop this part of the work, I should be delighted. But the first was just to show you when we tried to map their Facebook friends within the 27 kids of the class. It was pointless because they were all Facebook friends. So as you can see, this diagram tells us nothing, except to make that point again, which is they are all keeping all their possibilities open. They don't know where the action will come from. They don't know where the interest will be. So they keep all their possibilities open. The struggle, of course, in looking at a kind of a whole class network here is in thinking about the wider networks that each individual is part of. So each individual has the 27 other kids in the class as their Facebook friends, except for a few kids on the right-hand side. But this is 1/10 of their contacts. And then each is part of a completely overlapping, but also very different set of networks. And that's the struggle that I'm thinking about now. The way in which they are thoroughly embedded in their class and their relations within the class, and yet they are also part of something much wider. So, okay, this is just the connections. If we ask who do they talk to, who do they chat with, the class becomes much thinner. The network becomes much lesser. I've coded here, this is girls and boys, and this is based on asking the kids who they talk to. This is not me tracking their text or anything. And what you can't see, but I can see knowing who the kids are, is that the centre is the white middle class boys. The little loop over on the side is the black ethnic boys. This is the clever girls. They talk to each other. This is the cool girls. They talk to each other, but they're in with the boys. There's a funny little group here, which sets itself apart as the kind of the rather different. And I'm just now playing with this. So, you know, this is hanging out, messing around, geeking out, if you like. So who do they hang out with? It's a very similar pattern. The clever girls do their thing, this funny little group, the ethnic boys, the cool girls, and the middle class boys. If we ask who do you do something out of school with, it's just not about the class at all. Because they do out of school activities, but they do them with other people that we didn't ask about. And the class has ceased to be a very meaningful space for them. Then this was our attempt to see if it transferred into formal learning. So do they begin to learn, do those networks provide the wherewithal for them to support each other in their learning and ask for homework help? And yes, you can see that it does. So the same kinds of digital networks or chat networks underpin the learning help. You can see a kind of a tight group among the ethnic boys there. This group you can see is kind of more linked in. The clever girls suddenly have their moment because they're asked about homework even though no one wanted to hang out with them. And so the patterns are kind of different, but you can begin to see And then just one last one. We asked for their ego networks as well. And I've just picked out here the clever girls, the group that was, where are they? These are the ethnic boys. And this was a kind of little cluster that were out on their own. And suddenly you see, okay, some of the kids who seem quite isolated or separate or in particular subgroups in the class, they have plenty of friends, they're supportive, but the supports are not within the class. And I'm just trying to think about what does it mean that they spend all their day in certain networks within the class, and yet outside, some of them have a very significant ethnic group, a very significant community group, very large extended families, and others, for others the class really is the key connection and about all that there is. Okay, so that was a bit rushed, but my last slide, let me just give you a sense of what I think I'm trying to say. I think the analysis of the spaces, the institutions of school and home, points to many occasions for disconnection as well as some potential for connection, but it also points to some positive views of disconnection, and it's the children's voting with their feet for positive views of disconnection. I think that is something we need to pay attention to. So that kind of connected learning vision of how things could be otherwise has very little resonance with the teachers, the children, or the parents that we interviewed. And in a sense, they have all absorbed and accepted the kind of competitive individualism, the kind of container classroom and separate home spaces that traditionally our societies have moved towards. And they kind of acquiesce in that. So they are not necessarily looking for the connection that theorists hope that they might be. And therefore, the digital is being quite creatively and persistently used to support separate worlds rather than connected worlds. I think the analysis of the networks begins to show some of the, both the shared and the individual, begins to show the importance of the ways in which children are building diverse and meaningful possibilities through and around those container images, but they're each doing it in very different ways, and all kinds of constraints and possibilities are marking out what the networks are that they build, including the class, the year group, the previous school, the neighbourhood, the ethnic identities, and the nuclear and extended family. Some links are not being built. There are no links up and down age year groups within the school. There are very few or none of these kind of mythic global pen friends that children might make much more broadly. There are rather few hobby and fan groups. So 3 spaces, 3 kinds of processes that we hope will connect up, but children, parents, adults, for various reasons also seeking out opportunities to disconnect as well as to connect. And what I think they're doing, as I've kind of hinted, is really kind of keeping open, keeping control over when and how they connect, rather than either endorsing complete separation or throwing their lot in with the possibilities of connection. So it's finding keeping control over how they have their spaces separate from the adults that I think is motivating a lot of the youthful connections and networking. And I'll stop there.